So again, welcome to the Enhancing Lean Implementations with Activity-Based Planning webinar. My name is Gary Cox, and my co-host Mike Haley will be joining us momentarily. He's online, just off camera at the moment, but he will be joining us. A little bit of introductions about who Barrington Ops is. That's the organization I work with, and who Landmark Decisions are, the organization that Mike is with. I'm going to be going through a bit of a lean overview for you and with you, and show you a little bit about lean. Then I'm going to pass it off to Mike, and Mike is going to be showing you and linking those activities to the activity-based planning and the role of that. So we'll see how lean and activity-based planning work together throughout that. And Mike has actually got a bit of a case study he's going to show you and tell you a little bit about. Then we're going to sort of summarize and how these two things work well together, how activity-based planning and lean work well together. And then we're going to take your questions and answer those. So, all right. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Gary Cox. I'm a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt. I've been with Barrington Consulting since 2015, but before that I had a lifetime career with Canada Post. I finished my career as the National Director of Process Engineering, responsible for the deployment of the Lean Six Sigma program at Canada Post. I love to teach and coach green belts and black belts and teach continuous improvement and value stream mapping, and this whole idea of what Mike brings to the table with activity-based planning has really worked well with the blend of, for me. I'm really excited how these two things work together. These are the services that Barrington Ops provides. We do everything operational reviews all the way through to workshop facilitation. I'm not going to get into a sales pitch. If you want to know more about us, we'd love to tell you more. Just visit our website and you'll be able to hear all kinds of things about what the services we offer. So at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Mike. Mike is going to introduce himself, and there he is there. Nice to see you, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Gary, and hi, folks. Happy to be here, and let me just give you a little bit of background on Landmark and myself. So I am unbelted, but do have a master's in chemistry of all things, and I moved into manufacturing operations. That's when I became aware of activity-based planning, in understanding better ways to do costing and process optimization and so on. So I enjoyed it so much, I actually started my firm in the early 90s. I have a partner in Toronto. So we've got two parts of the country covered. And we work in a number of facets with Consortium for Advanced Management. That's where some of this methodology was originally developed. About 20 so years ago. And we do a lot of training now with CPA Canada and with our own clients as well. So like Gary, very happy to be working together with him and hopefully share with you how we feel these two components align. So our objectives, hopefully, that you'll come away with today is that better understanding of the basics of lean and ABP. I mean, obviously in an hour we can't cover all the details, but hopefully we'll give you some of the high-level points and more importantly, how they link together. We'll talk about the value of doing collaborative what-if scenario playing and creating a sandbox for testing lean initiatives and process improvement initiatives, resource planning initiatives, and so on. And to do that, we'll talk about specifically one software, but I'll talk generally in software about activity-based planning software. And the case study that I have actually involved one of those softwares. So we'll walk you through that in that case study. So I'm going to pass the ball back to Gary.
So thanks, Mike. So when we think about lean and activity-based planning and the whole concept of lean, organizations, we like to look at it in the terms of an organizational structure and a management system. So Toyota was the first to kind of bring out this idea of management systems and how all organizations have a management system. And we like to use the 4 Ps associated with the management system. So organizations need to be aligned to a purpose, or they have a philosophy, is the big P, as Toyota would say. And organizations that have a purpose or a vision or a mission, that would be considered their first P. And of course, they don't accomplish that without people, which would be be the second P. So people accomplish the purpose. Well, how do people accomplish the purpose? Well, they accomplish that through processes. So we think about processes connect people to purpose. So when we think about how organizations work, we like to think about the fact that processes are the way by which people accomplish a purpose. Most organizations kind of stop there. They kind of think about their organizations and they don't have a mature process by which they identify problems or identify how processes may or may not be working and how do you optimize those processes. And that's kind of what our focus is today. Our focus today is going to be around making sure that we spend our time thinking about the whole idea of problems and processes and how do we integrate those, because that's where lean and lean thinking or Lean Six Sigma thinking is. It addresses that fourth P. It's the maturity component of an organization to help their entire structure. So whether you're managing inside the process, the business with daily management, or whether you're working on the process in trying to make sure you're optimizing your projects or your continuous improvement efforts, we're going to focus on that whole component of processes and identifying and managing problems within those processes. So let's kind of think about, first of all, people will often ask me, what is lean? And you may have heard the term before, and maybe you're familiar with APB, activity-based planning, but you're not familiar with lean. So this is a good time to actually launch the poll, Mike. So Mike, if you've got we've got a poll for you. We're going to ask you a question. And the question is, why did you tune in today? Did you tune in because I've heard about lean, but haven't heard of ABP? Or have you heard about APP, but not really thought about how lean fits? Or you've watched some previous webinars that Barrington Ops has put on, or the last webinar that Mike and I hosted, and you're saying that's prompted me to watch this one, or you simply run out of stuff to do. You say, hey, I got something else better to do. So let's see how you're doing there as it regards to that. So I'm watching the results on my other screen here, and I'm seeing that quite a few of you have, okay, interesting. The last time we did this poll, we did this seminars, we had a small percentage, about 4%, who had run out of stuff to do. I see we got about 8% here that said that. So here's kind of the results of the poll today. Last time we did this webinar, we had a 44% had heard of lean but not APP, and 44% had heard of APP but not lean. Here we've definitely got more people who have heard about lean but not about APP. So we're excited to be able to help you bridge that knowledge gap. And for the 25% of you that have heard of lean, APP but not lean, again, we're hoping to be able to bridge that. For the rest of you, well, we're glad you joined us. Let's just leave it at that. So what is it about lean? So lean is really about focusing on value from the customer's perspective. So when we think about value from the customer's perspective, we want to make sure we're providing the highest possible quality product or service that we can. And obviously, we want to do that at the lowest possible cost. And we want to be able to provide that in a timely way that allows customers to have the service they want when they want it, or the product they want when they want it. And to do that, we kind of want to think about how we work as a whole. And we really want to identify waste. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what waste is and so on. But it's really about optimizing the process performance or process excellence. How do we look at that end-to-end process and what we do and how we do it to provide that value to our clients and to our customers. And there's a lot of methodologies to do that. Plan, Do, Check, Act is one of those. Lean Six Sigma is another one. And these kind of all work together in optimizing. And so lean is really about understanding and focusing on removing waste from your process. And in lean, we use the terminology Tim Woods. That's the acronym we use to sort of describe what waste is. And so we look at transportation and how our services or products are moving around inside of our organization or externally with suppliers. We look at the inventory buildup, and that inventory can be in the form of an actual widget or something that we're product that we're producing, or it could be an inventory of orders or an inventory of emails or an inventory of softer transactional type activities. Motion is about the movement of the individuals, how they're moving or searching online and doing things. We have waiting, pretty obvious waiting, what waiting is. If you're waiting for somebody to approve or you're waiting for a particular product or service or part, then that's obviously a problem. Overprocessing, we think about how we're producing more than the next step needs. So if we think about overprocessing, if I'm producing a product or a service and I'm passing it over to Mike, and Mike is not being able to work that process when I send it over to him, then we create inventory. So overprocessing usually creates inventory. Overproduction is likewise, it's an inventory producer. We want to be careful about producing inventory at any moment inside of our process. Now, defects is one of those key ones that we think about in lean activity-based planning has really helped, in my mind, highlight the challenges around defects and rework and how rework really drives up cost and lowers productivity and quality. And we want to think about defects and, of course, skills, which is, again, anytime you have people inside your process and their skills are either underutilized or they're not actually trained to be able to maximize that particular component of work, then you're running a risk of skills. And a little example I use is Outlook. Everybody knows how to use or has used Outlook or uses email, but if you haven't been trained in how to effectively use that as a tool, then chances are you're using that tool in an ineffective way. It's an underutilized skill that you can be using. So we want to think about skills as well. So let's kind of think about it in the terms of, I got to give you an example. So we've got this lean illustration of the drug and food and drug regulation compliance process. We have drug compliance as it relates to a value stream map. So just going to quickly walk you through a very simple value stream map and what that means for us. So let's assume we have a service standard that we're going to provide an inspection report to a particular organization within 30 days of receiving the request for an inspection to take place. So we go about and we do that. And so we have these three primary activities. The primary activity is we go out and do a site visit to the institution. We have a look. We come back. We start to create the report, but that generates some inquiries. So we make some calls or some follow-up to the site visit. Maybe even have to go back and do a second site visit because we're missing pieces of information. And then, of course, we write the report and submit that report back to the organization. So from the time we get that report to the time we provide that is what we call the time to serve. Or in lean term, we use the term lead time. So the lead time from the time somebody says, hey, I want to have an inspection report to the time we provide that report is our overall lead time. So let's kind of think about it in the terms of the elapsed time that takes place. So we would say that it takes me 2 days to do a site visit. I come back, I do some inquiries. It takes me a couple of days to do that. And then it takes me 4 days to write the report. So we would call that the elapsed time, and that would be 8 days of elapsed time. But the processing time, the actual time I'm doing the site visit, or the time I'm actually making and finding out information about the inquiries, or the time I'm actually spending typing the report is far less than the elapsed time. We call that the processing time. So, for example, I go out and do a site visit. It might take me 450 minutes to do a site visit. Making phone calls might take me 180 minutes, and actually writing the report, 720 minutes, or the equivalent of 3 days. So we talk about the processing time different than the elapsed time. But in between each of these steps, we've also got waiting time. So let's say, for example, you request me to come and do a site visit to you, but I've got 6 other people ahead of me, you, right? So the waiting time becomes 12 days. So because it's taking me 2 days to do a site visit. So you're sitting there for 12 days waiting for me to come out and do a site visit. Or between the site visit and the inquiries, I'm doing other stuff. So it sits there for 4 days, as an example. We call that the waiting time. And so here we've got 26 days of waiting time. So our total elapsed time or time to serve is actually 34 days, which is well above our 30-day service level agreement that we've said we're going to commit on. We measure that in the terms of what we call a value-added ratio in Lean. We look at the processing time, and which in this case we've determined to be 3 days, and we look at our total lead time or our time to serve, which is 34 days, and we divide those and we create a value-added ratio percentage. In this case, our value-added ratios are pretty low, 9%. That means that 9% of the actual time it took from the time we started this process to the time we delivered the product, we were actually only providing value to the customer, only 9% of that process. How do you improve that? And where do you know where to focus your improvement efforts? In this particular simple scenario, we could turn to activity-based planning to kind of help us with that in support of a Lean initiative, or a Kaizen event. So I'm going to pass it over to Mike. And Mike is going to kind of talk to us a little bit about how ABP works.
Okay, I'm back, folks. So continuing on from Gary's story, and this was actually work done at Health Canada a number of years ago, not in implementing Lean and ABP, but the actual example. So it is a real life example. So we have the activities left to right as far as the process flow, but if you think about what's driving those activities, we need to really understand what are the program and or client/customer demands. And in the case of Health Canada and doing these food and drug compliance, two of those outputs, and they would have many more, are doing inspections and doing assessments to ensure food and drug organizations are compliant with regulations. So we would then look at how the activities support each one of these particular outputs. And then moving up the chain, we'd also try to understand what are the resources necessary to deliver on those activities. So the people, the equipment, the facility. So these would be considered some of the indirect resources. We actually have some symbology here to represent two types of resources: fixed resources, and we have variable resources. So a contractor might be a consulting or somebody that's basically being outsourced to do the reporting of the part of that process. So first step in ABP is understanding business flows from outputs right through to resources and from the bottom up. And when we go then to look at the operational data that we need to populate these models to actually create a mathematical model that allows us to do planning, we look at some of the operational performance information. So generally most organizations do a pretty good job at keeping track of their outputs. So how many inspections were done in a time period, how many assessments. So let's say this was a monthly time period and we had 40 inspections that were being done and let's say 20 assessments. So we would track those. If we then knew how much activity is required, how much of each activity is required to support that, we could determine the total number of activities that would take place in that time period. So let's say on average it takes 2 site visits. So they have to go out and inspect that facility twice to ensure they're compliant. Similarly, we have a consumption rate at the resource level. So in this case, we're pointing to the one from the field team. So what we're saying is how many labor hours on average does it take to do a site visit? So let's say that number is 4. So it might be 3 hours on site and maybe it's a half-hour commute back and forth from their facility. So if we did the math on this, we'd say, okay, we have 40 inspections times 2 is 80 site visits. Times 4 is 320 labor hours. So once we know from all of the flows up, we can actually compare that to the capacity of each of these resources. So most fixed resources will have a finite capacity for, again, that time period that we're investigating. And if we know that, we can actually then determine another operational performance information of utilization. So how well are we utilizing the various resources that we have available to us? And are we able to do actually the work that is required? So that's kind of what we call the first pass, and that's a bottom-up flow. We can bring financial information into this, because if you think about it, the dollars in your organization are actually to support the resources. You pay for your people, you pay for your facilities, you pay for your contractors, your equipment, so depreciation, leases, all of those things can be mapped to the resource structure of your business. And now that we've made that causal linkages from resources, activities, and outputs from the bottom up, we can actually pull those dollars back down through this model, and we can get at things like the activity cost. So how much does it cost to do an information query? How much would a site visit cost? How much would an assessment or an inspection cost? And you can take this right down to the client level. So if you can segment your clients into the type of services or products that they request of your organization or your business process, then you can actually determine what the cost is. And if you're in a revenue position, then you can actually look at the profitability of that. So that's kind of activity-based planning in a nutshell. Bottom up, top down is kind of a two-pass process to understand resource planning and to look at the cost impact of that. So linking this back to lean, so here's what Gary took us through, basically what we call the time to serve, or the total lead time. So lean does a wonderful job from left to right and identifying where wastes occur and looking at optimizing the business process. And where ABP comes in is to actually better understand the resources required to do those, look at utilizations, look at the impact of performance improvements or process improvements and its impact on utilization and how resources are being deployed. We call that the capacity to serve, which quite often is tied to the quality of the service or the product that you're delivering. And then because we can pull the dollars back down, we can actually get at that cost to serve. So we have all aspects of, back to the triangle that Gary, with regard to cost, quality, and time. We can manage that all together in an integrated fashion. Okay, I'm going to switch here now to actually a live software. We're going to use this one called Collaborative Business Planning. This is one of many tools in the suite of activity-based planning tools, and they exist at kind of all levels of software companies. So the big guys like Oracle and SAP have tools generally very tightly integrated with their financial systems, and then there's a series of, I'll call it, niche vendors. Collaborative business planning being one of those. We chose this one because it's actually one that was used in the case study we had coming up, but it's also a Canadian product, developed in Ottawa and used now in the federal and provincial government, as you'll see in the case study coming up. So I'm just going to exit out of here, and I'm going to bring up this application. So what we have here in this tool is the ability to look at very visually at the business in terms of the outputs, in this case our inspections and our assessments, in terms of the activities, and in terms of the resources. You see on the sides here, there's just basically listings of what is in your model, and I'll show you how some of these are used as we maybe run through a scenario, process improvement scenario. So the flow, we have site visits, going to info queries, doing reporting. I've added this extra one here because when we do typically a lean or lean Kaizen, you start understanding the process a little bit better. When we talk to the field team, we find that they actually wind up going out again to do visits, because sometimes when they get there, the client's just not ready. They haven't got the information that's being requested. So they almost say they've wasted that visit, but they have to go back for another visit beyond the average 2 visits. So we would call that, and here we talked about complete and accurate. So this is saying for all these site visits, only 75% are complete and accurate, i.e. 25% need to be revisited. So that's what that extra activity, and that would be obviously a target for optimization from a lean initiative point of view. Let's start at the top, though. I mean, we know the bottom, from the bottom up is the way things are calculated, but I want to start at the top and just show you some of the cost flows that happen in this. So we have our building. It has 1,400 square feet available to us. We need 1,200 right now. And if we open up these, we can actually see here's where some of the financial information sits. So our lease and insurance would sit on that. This is where, again, I'm not going to go through too much the details on this particular piece of software, but we can actually manage the capacity here. And if I go down to the field team, I can see I've got a cost of $20,000, and this is a monthly model, P6, and $4,000 in benefits. This one's actually described with what we call a variable. So I can use a variable which describes the number of people, and this would be then the average salary. So the value of the variable is if I flex that variable, I'm actually going to add cost or decrease cost, depending on which way I go. And if I look at how that variable is used in the determination of capacity, we say that every person has 160 hours in a month to provide practical work. So that total of 640. So I can flex operational information and financial information with variables. They're commonly used in these types of software products. Becomes very handy for scenario planning, as we'll see shortly. So as I move down, I look at my site visit. If I go and look at my site visit, there are no costs on activities. Really, all our dollars sit on the resources. Activities are really free until they consume a resource. So we can actually see what the total costs and what the unit costs are. And at any point, I can go and I can look at what's coming into this particular object, in this case, the activity, and where do those actually costs flow. So it allows me to kind of do some analysis on where the costs and identify maybe some big hitters associated with why costs are so high. And to keep the finance folks happy, basically, because it'll track, these softwares will track all of your cost segmentation, you can basically think of it as a P&L at any point in the model. So you can see this in this tool, basically allows you to see some costs directly on the diagram and some operational flows and so on. We have some revenue. So in Health Canada, they actually have service fees. So they actually charge for the services of inspections and assessments. And they don't talk about it in the public sector as far as profit. That would be a no-no probably. But they do talk in terms of cost recovery. So that's what we're looking at here. We're saying overall for this month, we haven't done a very good job on cost recovery. We're $4,000 short of where we should be. And most of that's coming from inspections. All of it from inspections, because it's costing us an extra $140 for every inspection we do. We're making a little money, or we're definitely recovering on assessments, but we're losing here. The big question is what happens next period? Let's say next period we anticipate we're going to have to increase from 40 to 50 inspections. What are going to be the operational impacts of that? So if I recalculate the model, it tells me, ooh, can't be done. And it identifies where the bottleneck is. So we're at 104% utilization. One thing you may have noticed is that all the financial information rather disappears from the model. And that's very important because if you're doing standard costing or even some types of activity-based costing, without having the constraints of your business, you may extrapolate falsely into the future beyond what your business is capable of delivering. So to reinforce this tool basically says, no, I'm not going to tell you anything about finances until you fix the operational issue. So you would be doing, let's say, a lean exercise to say, where are there opportunities? We talked about this one in site revisit, but when we talk to the field team, they tell us, yes, that is indeed a problem. So we have a bit of a Kaizen and we come up with some brainstorming ideas and say, what could be done? Maybe one of the things could be done would be to implement some training to better educate the client, sort of back to that skills component that Gary talked about in the Tim Woods. So if we did some training, let's test this out before we kind of commit to going ahead and doing the training. What would the expected impact be? So the field team sort of says, well, gee, we did enough training, we should get it right the first time. So we could actually change our complete and accurate to 100%. So I can go in and I can actually just change that variable from 0.75 to 1. And I could see, would that be enough? Would that be enough? And yes, lo and behold, I can actually, if I could remove this inefficiency, I could see the benefit, and I can be actually at 90% utilization. So I have a little bit of flex there. So that might be something worth pursuing. So to test out this, like what is the cost of that activity going to be, that training, I would add that activity in. Let's just call it training. And I say, okay, now I've got to link that with what is the training being done to support. So the training is being done to support the inspections. So I'll make that link there. And who is going to do the training? We'll have the field team. Obviously, they're the most knowledgeable in what needs to be acquired. So I'm going to link that in. I'm going to do a little repositioning here just to make it look a little prettier. And that's kind of important too. One of the advantages of these types of ABP tools is their ability to engage people in understanding the business process. And literally the picture is worth 1,000 words. So it's worthwhile spending the time and understanding how to best position these and make them easy for all people in the organization to understand. So by default, the tool will actually put a 1 in. So we're not going to do one training session for every inspection. We're going to do one, let's say, every fifth training, every fifth inspection. So I'm going to make that consumption rate 0.2. And how long is the training session going to be? It's not going to be an hour. We're probably going to have, let's say, a half day. So I'm going to make that 4 hours. So now we're going to be consuming field team. Is it going to be enough? Do we have enough capacity? And when I run the model again, it says, yeah, I should be worried because you notice this went from green to yellow. So that means I should pay attention here because 96%, there may be some false economies there and may remove some flexibility in the organization. So we say, okay, that's worthwhile doing. Let's go ahead and do the training. We know what the cost of that's going to be. What we find out subsequent to doing the training is there's an extra benefit. So the extra benefit is that now the site visits actually aren't taking us 4 hours. We can get them done in 2 hours because the folks are ready for us. They have the information on hand. So we could understand what the impact of that is. I can change that from 4 to 3. I don't need the equipment, the same amount so I'm going to change that from 4 to 3. And I can rerun that model. And I can say, oh, now I've got some extra capacity. Yet there's another benefit. So we find out, I didn't explain, down here we have the information queries. So basically the client is calling in saying, what do I need? What did I supply this correctly or what else? So these queries, and on average, it says that they take 3 calls per inspection to resolve those. Those are obviously going to consume resources. And let's say the training actually reduces those. I only have to do 1 query. So if I run that one now, you see my utilization's actually down to 70%, maybe down to the point that I could actually look at redeploying. We won't put this guy out on the street, but we could redeploy a resource. And if I do that, change that down to 3, I can see, okay, I'm at a manageable level of utilization. I've reduced some cost, obviously, with the labor, and I've overall made a profit. I've done a better job at cost recovery to the point where in the public sector, I'd probably need to adjust my service fees and so on. So anyways, just a little illustration to show you how those tools kind of work and how we can combine some of the thinking of lean and being able to model and do scenario playing and get at resource utilizations and costs. So I'm going to go back to the slide deck here. And I want to take you through a real life example. And this is from a Crown Corporation here in Nova Scotia called Nova Scotia Crown Lending. For those folks here in the province, you'll recognize them probably as the Nova Scotia Farm Loan Board and the Nova Scotia Fisheries and Agriculture Loan Board. So they've had some certain challenges over the last couple of years. First of all, they've been pushed together as one agency. So they come from 2 different departments with 2 different sets of regulations, with 2 different sets of fees and acts, and yet they're trying to each understand the other process. They have some challenges in outdated systems. Yes, who doesn't these days? And also competitive pressures from the banks and getting a little bit more aggressive on loans. So these organizations basically provide loans to fishers and farmers in the province to really stimulate the economy with regard to agriculture and the fisheries. So it's not a large organization, 26 people. We've got an operating budget around $2.3 million, and about 1,500 active loans in place. Average loan would be about $200,000. So what they knew they needed to do was to try to optimize their business and move towards a common future state process that could service both sectors, agriculture and fisheries. So what we did with them, we did a lean Kaizen event. Gary mentioned that term, Kaizen. That's a very focused, it was a 5-day exercise. It was basically an all hands on deck, looking at the business process and ways to optimize that. From that, we took that information, we developed an activity-based planning model. To do that, we needed to do a little bit more detail on the activity analysis and some workload analysis. So we'll explain that. They then used all of this information in this tool I just showed you, collaborative business planning, and then validated that against the 2018-19 volumetrics and financials. And then got a lot of new learnings from that, but more importantly, use that model then to predict what could be happening with it in terms of process improvements and where they needed to go strategically. So let me move to the next slide, and I'll invite Gary back in to take us through what is commonly known as a swim lane diagram.
Yeah. So thanks, Mike. So this is a typical result of an Kaizen type event where you get together with a number of the stakeholders and you simply map out their process. It's a swim lane process map is what it is. And some of the things I want you to take note of is on the left side of your screen, you'll see all the green sticky notes. All those green sticky notes are the various stakeholders, and you'll see that each one of them has their own lane. We will call that a swim lane. Those of you who are 58% of you are familiar with lean, so you're probably very familiar with this type of process map. And what you'll see is the dotted lines that are vertically running through that swim lane are the various components or various stages of the process. So we see the very first stage is the intake phase, and you'll see that intake phase in this particular process goes through 4 different stakeholders on the intake component, and then gets transferred over to the next phase. And you'll see within that, as we call them the diamonds, these are decision points where you ask yourself a question as it relates to that process, and we want to look at that. So when we do this, some of the things that we want to look at, I mentioned about complete and accurate, and I mentioned about processing time, and I mentioned about elapsed time in looking at a value stream map. Well, that's kind of what we do here in this activity as well. So what we want to do is we want to see the components of the processes. Here, for example, we've got enters and creates file folders. So that's the verb, the activity that's happening. And we ask ourselves, well, how long does it take them to do that? Well, it takes them 15 minutes of actual activity to create that file and transfer those files into potentially an E folder. Well, how long does it take during the course of the day? Well, maybe they're not doing it at a 15-minute setting. Maybe they're doing it for 5 or 10 minutes, and then they go off and have to do another activity, and they come back. So the elapsed time is half a day. How many times do they do that right the first time? Well, it turns out that this particular step, the complete and accurate component, is 90% of the time, which means 10% of the time they're having to repeat something. So you think about that. For every 10 files they create, one of those files has to be looked at a second time, which in itself may sound okay, 90%, that's a pretty good percentage, a high score. But keep in mind, if you manifest that across an entire process, and in this case, this is like one step of probably better part of 30 or 40 steps. If each step is working at 90%, then they're impacting the overall performance of that process. So I want you to think about it. Group A and Group B, Step A and Step B, both functioning at 90%. So Step A has 90%, Step B can only do 90% of 90%. The customer experience is a multiple of that. So the customer experience in a 2-step process is 81%. And if you add a third step that's working at 90%, well, they're working at 90% of 81%. So their output is 76%. So you can see very quickly how the experience of the customer or the client diminishes greatly that things are done right the first time all the way through that process. So that's kind of what we look at when we look at it. We look at how can we effectively improve this process through identifying the opportunities in a Kaizen event that allow us to improve the accuracy, reduce the overall time to serve, the elapsed time, and ideally make that processing time the smallest unit possible. So I'm going to kind of pass it back to Mike, because what we would traditionally do is take this and then transform it into some sort of software. And this is the kind of software that we would look at. In this case, this has been converted into this program. There are other programs that Mike's talked about, but certainly the components associated make it a lot cleaner and easier to look at. And if you've got software that's in behind that supporting the math behind this, now you've got a very powerful tool. So back to you, Mike.
Great, thanks, Gary. Yeah, so this tool is a product called Qualware. And actually, why we use Qualware, because the client was using this collaborative business planning. And CBP actually sits on the Qualware platform. For those of you tuning in from Ottawa in the federal market, Qualware is actually the Government of Canada's standard for what's called enterprise architecture. But it also has a variety of tools, one of which does a really great job at swim lanes. So we're able to kind of blend the value, again, of lean and ABP in this regard. So if I look at these key labor roles that Gary pointed out, those become part of our resource structure and our ABP model. The key processes that were highlighted, how we group our activities, and then the activities themselves that were identified as part of the Lean Kaizen would be the components that will be really the guts of the ABP model. So we can take all of that information and bring it into, in this case, CBP, to do the resource planning and the costing aspect. As Gary pointed out, a lot of these tools have functionality even in their own right. So this Qualware tool will allow you to have things like, they call it hands-on time, that would be your processing time, and also your elapsed time. And it actually has some smarts that can actually do simulations on flows, as well as best and worst case scenarios and things like that. So there's an extra value with this particular tool. So some of the things that they do, they take in the client application. So we talked about that. Gary talked about that in creating the file. And then they have a series of activities, both for the fisheries new loan process and the farm new loan process. And here's where we make those changes. Those are those two loan commit documents. And you can actually see, I appreciate it's a bit small, but you can see those are the two most expensive activities for each of these processes. About $81,000 just to handle loan commitments on an annual basis, just the loan commitment documents, and about $19,000, recognizing that farm loans are about less than half of what fisheries loans were in this fiscal year. So the opportunity then was we bring in, so the LATT comes from the labor above. We're actually capturing, because we're doing basically all this workload analysis, we identify things like general events. So we want to actually understand what the costs are. These are all things like handling your emails, meetings, all that stuff that I'll say prevents you from doing real work. So they wanted to capture that and see if there was ways they could improve that. So this was the way that we did that. And then we pull that other part of it into this, what's called fully loaded time. And that brings in other costs like staff expenses. So when you're talking about how labor resources, you want to talk about fully loaded costs. So everything necessary to support that person as they're doing the work. That way all those costs will roll down into the work that's being done, which kind of explains as well why some of those are large numbers. The main reason, though, is because of the amount of time that's taken. So the changes that were made, we reduced an hour and a half out of this for the loan commit document fisheries, and we did the same for the farm. So then it was a question of what would the impact be. So if we look at the demand structure of the outputs, we have new loans fish and new loans farm. First real aha moment for Crown Lending was what the magnitude of those costs were. So basically about $3,500 to process a new fisheries loan, and about 50% more, 5,200 to do a farm loan. But now the opportunity says, where could we make our gains? And if you look at some of these key processes, if you look at application processing, that's one of the big hitters. So if we look at saying processing for fish is only about $1,000 per application versus $2,300. And again, if we want to look at where that loan admin folk come in, they work in this process. They also work in staff review and approval, and they do some work here. So all of those activities we saw on the previous screen come in this way. And again, if I wanted to get more details, if I was interactive with the tool, I could drill in, I could see where the flows are coming from. And here's again is where the big hitter of that is. It's the amount of preparation of loan summaries that are so much significantly higher given the volume within the farm loan basis. So in summary, some of the key takeaways for them were the better workload analysis. They finally understood who was doing what and where some of the challenges were. The operational model gave them this visual map so they could all get on the same page and understanding it. They were able to do comparative analysis between the two in the goal of moving together towards one common process and identifying the big hitter costs. So all of these lean initiative ideas that come up out of doing a Kaizen, now you can actually prioritize those and go after, let's say, the low-hanging fruit, but the biggest bang for your buck. So that was kind of where they at, and they're still working on using this and optimizing that business process. So to summarize, hopefully we've been able to illustrate. I'll talk on the ABP side, then I'll let Gary come in. Certainly from an ABP perspective, we build that consensus and understanding on operational and financial flows, marry those two things together. We understand where the constraints exist in the business process, and then we have a tool for doing what is, so doing scenario playing for future state planning and forecasting. Gary, do you want to talk about the lean?
So again, when it comes to the lean piece and the marriage here between lean and APP, this is about identifying. Lean is about identifying value for the customer and value for the client at the end of the day. And we want to be able to identify where waste is. And Mike walked you through the scenario with the Crown Lending, but and we could see where the opportunities potentially were. We could see that if the skill set required to do a certain task were reallocated to people within the organization, that and they talk about the loan manager and the elimination of some positions and the creation of new positions, they reallocated the skill level to be able to provide stronger value at the end of the day for the client at a reduced cost. And this is kind of where we want to think about reducing that lead time, reducing those operational bottlenecks, and identifying where those are. And the other thing that Mike has kind of been talking about, and we heard it quite often, was engaging the culture around looking at where those opportunities for improvement are. You don't create a process map in isolation. You have to bring people together to do that. You don't create this kind of APB planning map without having people in the room that are engaged in the discussion, and those become important components. And then there's this marriage that happens between the two. And this is really what excited me about working with Mike on the marriage of these two. Was we visualize the processes, we see the linkages, we see the outputs. We can take a prioritization component. We can look at potential solutions to problems and then map those out and say, what's the return on the investment for that? So if we're going to add training, if we're going to add new positions, and we're going to change the model, what does that look like? And you can do that before you actually even implement a change, which I think is really important and helps you manage your overall capacity. They really are very powerful tools when they're combined. So we're coming to the conclusion. I'm going to encourage you to type your questions into the chat box. Mike and I are going to be keeping our eye on the chat box and see if we can answer some of your questions. While you're doing that, I just want to let you know we do have another webinar scheduled for next Wednesday, May 13th. It's 11 a.m. to noon, or noon Eastern Daylight Time, or noon Atlantic Time. And we're going to be looking at the 20/80 rule, the Pareto principle, and we've actually got a guest. Ross Simmons is going to be our guest. I encourage you to look him up on LinkedIn. He's really He's an entrepreneur and he's a marketer and uses digital marketing, and we're going to be combining some lean thinking or some continuous improvement thinking with marketing, which is a very cool thing that we're excited to do that. We're going to have a repeat of this webinar on May the 25th as well. You're going to Mike will again talk a little bit about that. And Mike, I don't know whether you want to talk about the other activities you've got planned.
Yeah, if folks are interested certainly in a deeper dive into activity-based planning specifically, not as much on the lean, about how to go about building these models and some tips and techniques in that. We have two different types of offerings, very similar. One through our partner Close Reach, who's actually hosted this event for us today, coming up next week and in June, and then with CPA Nova Scotia in middle of June, we'll have one called Improving Business Process Through Cost Modeling. So again, you'd be welcome to search those out, or if you'd like us to send you these materials, there'll be a link there that you could get more information on that.
On behalf of Mike and I, we really want to say thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Any questions, our email addresses are here.